planning to mobilize across the state and the country to engage more Latinas in the census and the electoral process. Through HOPE's leadership programming, from our college to our adult programs, we will be playing a crucial role in mobilizing our Latinas of all ages through voter registration initiatives and having them write a variety of different op-eds to ensure that the Latina voice is collected in the media. As an organization in 2019, and some of you may be familiar with this campaign, we launched the hashtag Latinas Votes Count campaign to promote Latina participation in the census in the 2020 elections. The campaign included the release of a pledge which challenged Latinas to commit to filling out the census and voting for this year. But more importantly, it asked them to identify a new Latina voter and to ensure that she was engaged in the electoral process. To this date, we have gotten over 600 pledges, and these women have collectively committed to engaging 3,000 new voters and census takers. I invite all of you today that have not filled out the pledge and are interested to go onto our website to do so. Also on the HOPE website, you will find some additional resources for the census and the election. Our website is www.latinas.org / Latina Votes Count. Basically, go on our website, latinas.org. Earlier this year, in collaboration with other nonprofit groups, we conducted a poll of California residents to measure their attitudes. We will be releasing their attitudes around the election. We'll be releasing that poll later in this, not in this broadcast, but in a different one. So look forward to that information and that. But we do have an opportunity for all of us to be part of the solution and because it's a critical time in the country and our state, we have made a difficult decision for HOPE to transition all our programming to online. So all our leadership, as well as the upcoming leadership programs and an upcoming Latina Action Day, will be virtual. And we'll find different ways to advocate through this virtual until things come back to normal. Before we get started with the panel, we'll also like to get your input as an audience and as members of this conversation. And we'd like to start a poll, which is being released right now for you to participate in. I hope you see it. It has a few questions from have you taken a HOPE's pledge to have you responded to the 20 census questionnaire. If you could take a quick moment to fill out that poll. And in the meantime, I'd like to also invite you to familiarize yourself with the Q&A feature. You can submit questions there for the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can submit questions there for our panelists, and we'll try our best to get as many questions as possible later on into the conversation. So are we ready to see some of the results of the poll?
They're coming in, maybe just 20 more seconds.
Okay, we're going to take a couple more seconds, 20 specifically, to get some results. But as we're waiting for those, I do want to thank everyone for conversation and for taking some time to fill out the poll. And I would like to start turning this conversation over to our moderator, HOPE's board chair and senior program officer with the California Community Foundation, Rosie Arroyo, who will introduce the panelists and incorporate some of the poll knowledge into the Q&A. Rosie?
Yes, thank you, Helen, and thank you everybody for joining us for this important conversation. I really appreciate HOPE's leadership to organize this important webinar and see that many of you were able to join us. I believe there were about 230 people that registered, so it's great to see the interest in this subject. And so to get us started, I know we have a tight program. Our goal is to conclude by 5 p.m. I would like to introduce our panelists who will be sharing a few more highlights and some critical information about the 2020 census and the upcoming election. I would like to start by introducing Eli Flores, California Director of Civic Engagement with NALEO Educational Fund. At NALEO, Eli manages statewide citizenship, voter engagement, and census 2020 campaigns. NALEO Educational Fund is the nation's leading nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that facilitates full Latino participation in the American political process, from citizenship to public service. Eli began his professional career as a community organizer, challenging the mass incarceration of youth of color in California, and has gone on to work on numerous political campaigns, both at the local, national, international youth and community development initiatives. So we're very pleased to have Eli join us today. We also have Paul Mitchell, Vice President with Political Data, Inc. Paul is a data consultant based in Sacramento and also the Vice President of Political Data, Inc. For the past 25 years, Paul has been involved in politics and policy, from working on campaigns throughout the 1990s to running a major PAC from 2004 to 2008 and working directly for candidates as a general consultant until 2012. Some of his most successful work was in state legislative races, where he used data and mapping to help drive successful independent expenditure efforts. In the 2011 redistricting initiative, Mitchell led a team impacting legislative and congressional district lines with the structure of the state's new nonpartisan redistricting commission. And next, we would also like to welcome Stacy de Armas, Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at Nielsen. Stacy is a leader within Nielsen's diversity and inclusion practice. She is a researcher, consumer behaviorist, thought leader, and subject matter expert on the U.S. Hispanic market. Stacy is responsible for researching, uncovering, and sharing insights on the power of the Hispanic consumer with brands, media companies, advocacy groups, and policymakers. Stacy joined Nielsen in 1998 and has served in many roles related to multicultural marketing, but Hispanic market intelligence is her passion. So thank you to all our panelists for joining us. And, to get us started, before we dive into our conversations, I would just like to set up a brief backdrop to initiate our first question. And we know that there is no doubt that the U.S. Census is the most ambitious civic engagement effort undertaken by the nation. Its influence is particularly powerful on the quality of life of what the census consider our hardest to reach audiences, the U.S.'s most vulnerable residents, from like the children, seniors, immigrants, and the homeless, all of who have been historically undercounted. And as the most populous and diverse state in the nation, California has the most at stake for ensuring an accurate count. And we know we are facing a very unprecedented and significant challenges right now. And, to get us started, would like to initiate my first question to Eli. And see, Eli, if you can provide us with some additional background and context in terms of, the census, why it's important, and, you can share a few key updates of where we are now in terms of our timeline and progress in the census count. So if you can provide some highlights on that.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Rosie. And thank you so much to the HOPE team for allowing us to still convene. And we recognize that we couldn't be together in person. So we really, as NALEO, we really appreciate having the opportunity to present here. So as the question sort of asks, like, why is the census important? So the primary reason for the census being instituted originally was for the apportionment of congressional seats or seats from the House of Representatives, right? And so that was in its core the initial reason of why the census exists. But beyond that, the census data is really crucial, and it's the basis for making sure that our communities are well represented, right? That we have a democracy that represents all of our communities, the protections of civil rights, right? But also the over $1 trillion in federal funding that goes out to the states every single year. So this funding is specifically for programs that our communities use, right? So for example, we talk about some of our top 12 census guided federal programs. So we're looking at like Medi-Cal assistance programs, Medicare supplemental nutrition assistance programs, highway planning and construction, for example, Section 8 housing, the CHIP programs that ensure that children are covered in terms of their health. So all of these things are really as a result of the census data. So that's why as NALEO, we make census a really core function of our civic engagement work. But just to give you a quick snapshot of like what is going on now. So due to COVID-19, a lot of things have changed, right? So the first thing that has really changed is the delays in the census operations. And so I won't go deep into every single part of the operation, but for example, the self-response phase, which is the phase where people had the opportunity to respond on their own, has now been extended all the way through October 31st. But which means that a lot of the other operations that were intended to count certain segments of the population. So for example, at the group quarter operation, which typically counts folks who maybe are seniors who live in a senior home, folks who are enumerated through the homeless count as well, which is another operation with Census Bureau. All these things have also been delayed, which really pushes back the enumeration of all of these hard to count populations. And so that has really shifted the way that our organization and many organizations across the board are engaging in the census work. But nonetheless, the census work is as important today, right now, as it ever has been. And so I'll close with just saying that we are providing guidance to the field in terms of how to make some of these shifts, going from the traditional sort of tabling activities, community activities, events, or door-to-door canvassing that was supposed to take place, moving over to more of your online type of strategies and activities, switching in-person trainings to webinar trainings. And I'm sure if you are in the field, you probably have been part of numerous trainings on webinars by now, shifting from peer targeting to online targeting, shifting from outreach to more of a broadcast and sort of digital strategy to try to reach our Latino communities and the other communities abroad. So with that, I just close by saying it's super important. Please stay engaged. And if you have not yet done your census, I really encourage you to do your census today and really encourage the community abroad to do their census and to respond.
Thank you, Ellie. And, just to build on that, we know that, for example, the impact of the 1990 census on people's lives, was considered to be one of the most in U.S. history that resulted in a projected loss of about $2 billion in federal funds, as well as, one congressional seat for California. And so as we learn from past efforts and look at the challenges ahead with COVID-19 and, the physical distancing that, is now making outreach and engagement more challenging, there's growing concern, right, that there communities that are the hardest to reach communities are going to be also the hardest hit, and what that means for outreach and engagement. And particularly right now with the current landscape that we're in, there has been growing fear in the community and concerns about the protections, right, for vulnerable families, especially those that are concerned about their migration status. Many have expressed fear in filling out their census form, and those that are filling it out here are leaving some of the questions blank because they also have limited options to respond. So for Ellie and Stacy, if you can also just talk a little bit about what are things that, as organizations and leaders engage communities, what should they keep in mind in terms of information and messaging to share with community about filling out the census form, right? And what messages or information do you feel resonates the most with people during these times? So maybe, can start with Stacy and then turn over to Ellie.
Okay, sure. I think one of the things, at least from Nielsen's perspective and the business perspective, that's important to discuss is that, census is very important for the apportionment of dollars. And, in particular now we talk about whether or not we have resources available amid the crisis and, hospital beds, all of these things. But I think it's also really important to understand that it's really the definitive benchmark or the truth set for billions of dollars of economic activity that is outside of sort of social and community. And the foundational truth set for all businesses. Every business decision in some way is made with census as a base, whether it is employment needs or commercial needs, right? Where people are going to put stores, who lives in a specific area. And as far as Nielsen is concerned, the population projections and estimates that come from census are the basis and a benchmark for our surveys and our economic and social science research, which we do quite a bit of as well, and all of our market research, town by town, block by block level. And so while I don't really want to shift the focus and say it's really important because businesses use this data too, but that's also how they determine. I mean, think about all the things that happen with Amazon and with site selection for different companies. It has a lot to do with the demographics of a specific area. The shows that you watch on television and how they're measured are determined in many ways based on population data. So I want to, one of the things we tell people, as well as the importance of sort of the community impacts of ensuring that they're counted in census, is that it also is a benchmark for all businesses, large and small, right? For entrepreneurs that are looking to get into a category, to understand who their customer is and where they are.
Thank you, Stacy. Ellie, would you like to add to that?
Sure. You are totally correct, Rosie, in that our immigrant communities are amongst the hardest communities to reach in terms of the census. One is because they are the most fearful of responding to any type of government inquiry. But two is also because a lot of our immigrant communities have very low English proficiency, right? And so the information that you would normally get through mainstream does not get to them in such a way that is easily digestible or doesn't reach them in the places that it needs to reach them, right? So I think in terms of the fear that they have to respond to the census, I do think it is important to acknowledge that fear, right? To not ignore the fear of what that is. I think the Trump administration's effort to try to include a citizenship question was a fear tactic, right? It was a way to try to minimize and to lower the response of the immigrant community. So I think first is acknowledge that exists, right? But second is what messages continue to work for immigrant communities. The messages of programs continue to work. The messages of programs like for schools, for children, what it means for the next 10 years if we miss out on all of that federal funding for the programs that directly affect them on those type of messages still work. The messages of the protection of their data, right? I think the confusion is, one is how do I respond, right? So you can respond on paper, on phone, or through the internet, right? To the website. But two, it's also the protection of their data and how it is protected by law through Title 13. That message is important. So the fact that the census is secure and protected should be also included in the messaging out to the Latino communities and the immigrant communities.
Thank you. And also just, I know briefly just in terms of this year's census, right? I know, Ellie, you talked about like it could be done by paper, phone, or, online. Given the digital divide in the community, whether you, Stacy, or both can talk a little bit about just how that's impacting also the outreach and engagement for this year's census. And now, right, that with COVID-19, we've switched to everything, right, more online webinars, everything digitally. Can you just talk a little bit about, some of the challenges and how groups are addressing those challenges to deepen their reach?
I'll add from a data perspective, Latinos are the most connected of any group. So, whether it's via mobile or otherwise, but the fact, and Ellie said it best, the fear is really the opportunity for messaging. The other thing that we've been focusing on is we've been developing these video vignettes and trying to share them with Latino influencers, hoping that they, we know that Latinos are consuming a lot of content on video, on social, and all, and other channels. That Census has done a very good job. They're certainly on Instagram. There's a lot of places where we're receiving those messages both in English and in Spanish. But because we are a collectivist culture, we also understand behaviorally those messages are often best received from within our community, within our trusted networks. So we're working with influencers to share messaging. And one thing that you that you mentioned before, Ellie, is that you talked about fear and data privacy. The other thing we're sharing is that your documentation status is not important here, right? And I think that's also part of the message. People believe that and part of the fear and the security is, well, I don't want to respond because I'm undocumented or I'm in the process of documentation or whatever. And sharing, that's one of the message points we've been driving home, in addition to the 3 different ways that they can, that Latinos can respond, that their documentation status is not, doesn't matter at all, that they have, they're protected, and also that every single person be counted in the home. And those are, I think, some of the ways and some of the downfalls of our community in years prior. We have multi-generational households now, also that many kids are home from college, and so people are needing to get the information that their children that are home from school also need to be counted, or their children that may be displaced. So those are the messages that we are focusing on, and the way that we are reaching out as we're a business to business company, but we we have aligned ourselves, of course, with Census, with the community, and taken resources internally to try and share where we can with influencers about the importance of being counted and what it matters, what it means.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I appreciate that you also highlight the work with influencers, because I know for organizations like Hope and many that are on this call, are those trusted messengers to communities and are play such a critical voice and role. And so I did want to also just remind folks that if you have questions, I know a couple of people have been posting them on the chat box. We're going to be monitoring that. I know we do have some time for Q&A. So it's great to see that people are already sharing some questions. But, to continue to move us along into the conversation, would like to also invite Paul for this next question. To really think about, recently just in California, this has been an unprecedented year where we also as a state moved up our primary election from June to March 3rd. And now California, right, just in terms of its political influence and being part of the Super Tuesday primary, just really elevated, just that influence that California can have as a state. And so wanted to see that, you can just talk a little bit more about just what have you been seeing in terms of the voting experience in California, the engagement in the polling places through the voting centers. This was also a year where there's been a lot of change to the way people vote, and has definitely changed the overall voting experience for Californians. So would like to see, Paul, if you can just share any thoughts in terms of just what have you observed since the March primary, and how are you seeing the overall engagement and impact from that election and also the future elections?
Yeah, so thank you very much, and thanks for having me. We definitely had an interesting election in March. It seems like it was years ago. And we kind of made it right under the wire with regard to this health crisis. Obviously, a lot of states who had later scheduled primaries have postponed or maybe held them in very kind of precarious positions. We don't know a lot about what happened in March still. The counties were given extensions to their deadlines for completing the canvass and for reporting that data back to the state, and that's when we start to get the data. So we've obtained data at PDI for more than 40 of the state's 58 counties, but a lot of the counties that are outstanding are the big ones with heavy Latino population. So we'll really know more about the performance of different subgroups in the primary a little bit later. Mm-hmm. What we do know is that, like you mentioned, the election was held is part of this shift that we've been having to much, much more vote by mail. And this system that we've adopted, which is basically based on a Colorado system, where you have many, many more people receiving ballots in the mail. And in exchange for that, we're going to have fewer polling places, but those polling places are going to be open for a longer period of time. So it's a different way of doing the elections. And it was actually started in California in a little special election, not a special election, an off-year election in San Mateo in 2015. And then 5 counties did it in 2018 to kind of use it some more and get used to it. The big ones in that were Sacramento and San Mateo, but also include 3 other smaller counties. Napa was one of them. And in 2020, we've moved it to 15 counties. Now, 14 counties are doing the full system, which is a full vote by mail and these vote centers. One county, LA County, used kind of a hybrid where they went to vote centers to try to encourage people to vote earlier and have those greater voting options to be able to vote anywhere in the county. But they didn't do the full vote by mail as a part of that. LA County did do full vote by mail in portions of LA County that overlapped Orange County legislative and congressional districts, which did comprise about 20% of the county. But in the other 80% of the county, the only people that got vote by mail ballots were people who had requested them. And LA is one of the lowest vote by mail counties in the state. On election day, there were huge problems in LA, problems that we should not be accepting. We should never accept in California lines, multiple, people standing in line for 4 or 5 hours. I was literally leaving an election night, vote counting thing at about 11:30 at night, and I texted somebody at the Secretary of State's office and said, when are we getting the next update from LA County? And his response is, when are they going to be finished voting in LA County? There were still people in line that late, and that's unconscionable in this state with all the work that so many people have done to expand voting rights in California and to invest in our systems. So before the COVID thing even took root and we really understood the significance of this crisis and what it was going to mean for how we do everything, including elections, LA County already received a request from the Secretary of State's office, or more of a demand, to convert to all vote by mail for November. That was done because of a response to kind of the failures at the county on election day. Now looking at the election, understanding what we know now about this health crisis, the state is preparing to go all vote by mail for November. Really, the state is trying to answer the questions of how do you conduct an election if things are as bad as they are right now, when most Californians, unless they're in essential business, are being required to stay at home. There's this social distancing, and we're having to figure out how to, run elections, how to, make sure everybody can vote. So there's some good and bad news here for California. The good news is that this state is about 75% of this state is either in one of those vote center counties or is already vote by mail. So for about 75% of the state, they're already getting a vote by mail ballot to begin with. So that's good. There's another about 1 million voters who aren't permanent vote by mail, but have voted by mail in the past. So when you look at all that, we're looking at 81% of the state is either already vote by mail or has had some experience with it. So in a way, our system is set up almost by luck to be ready for it. It's almost as if, like, by luck, we had this crisis hit now, not 3 years ago when Zoom didn't exist. Like, we almost have been preparing for this and working from home for years. And in the same way, our elections have been preparing for a system like this. We are going to have in-person voting options for people, and the counties right now are dealing with challenges of they can't do their polling locations at senior citizen centers, hospitals or fire stations. They can't do them at schools. Where are they going to be able to hold elections? What volunteers are they going to be able to have at those elections if the volunteer base for elections is largely older people that are volunteering, at-risk people? So there's a lot that the state has been doing. The Secretary of State put together a task force recently where we'd have 75 or 90 people on Zoom calls going through a lot of the election administration process and trying to retool it for this coming November election. I think one of the important things especially for people who are participating in this, the thing they're going to want to know is, how does this impact turnout? How does this impact voting? The likelihood of the Latino community in particular to be able to effectively participate in elections, particularly since we know that Latinos in California aren't as truly represented in our registration. They're not as truly represented in our vote by mail. They're not as truly represented in who turns out and votes. And that results in elections that don't represent the state as a whole. And it's one of the biggest problems I think we face in the state with our elections. I think it's important to note that in California, with the massive amount of registration and re-registration we've been doing, we have a very clean voter file. If you're a voter who's moved multiple times, 5 years ago, your voter file and your registration, or your registration in your home would have kind of been disconnected and you'd no longer be registered to vote. Now your registration is moving with you as you move, particularly for younger Latinos. You'll see the average younger Latino will move more than once per election cycle. So it's an important issue. The quality of that voter data is going to be important to making sure turnout can work. We have some narratives around vote by mail, which I think are really unfortunate. In some of the social justice community and some of the California progressive community, there's been this fear of vote by mail because it was previously really a dominant among older, more conservative voters. Nationally, oddly, Republican conspiracy theory against vote by mail, because they think that it's going to increase young person turnout and that people are going to turn out in higher numbers than before. And in a way, both are wrong. Vote by mail in California can be effective, and it can be effective and help all voters participate. And it's been shown in California to be real.
Yeah. Well, one quick question, just to pick up a little bit on that. Because like Hope, an organization like Hope, and really looking at how to increase the civic engagement, participation among women, Latinas, women of color. How do you have is there any data available in terms of the participation of women and any trends that you think would be good for this audience to also keep in mind in terms of, their engagement efforts with community?
Yeah, so men and women traditionally in the state have pretty similar voting patterns, but within the Latino community, you have a couple things happening. You have you have socioeconomic impacts on voter turnout, and you also have real big age impacts on turnout. It's actually one of the things that's most striking about the Latino population and Latino turnout is how much it's tied to the age of the population of Latinos in California. So if you were to grab, the average Latina in California, you're going to be grabbing a segment of the electorate that's much younger than the rest of the state. And there's two things that are really amazing that are happening right now in the voter registration file and turnout in California. And that is that we've had this swelling of Latina voter registration coming in the younger ages, 18 to 25-year-olds. Well, it's been happening for as long as I've been talking about it. And while we've been doing this for the last dozen years, those 25-year-olds, they're now becoming 40-year-olds. And so, the first time I ever spoke to Hope and worked with Hope on elections, a lot of the voters we were talking about were, how are we going to get these 26, 28, 30-year-olds to vote? And what's happening is now we're both having on the front end younger voters, 18, 19-year-old, being predominantly Latino, but we're also seeing that predominantly Latino population start to hit that 40, 41, 42, 43-year-old population that turns out and votes in much greater numbers. So Matt Barreto, who's one of the leading kind of analysts of the Latino population, talks about how we have to look really closely at that Latino population, that surge as it's getting older, and their potential to really be that, waking up of the sleeping giant of Latino participation. So I think that we're in a key moment right now to see a real swelling of Latino participation in our elections, largely because this population's entering a older age.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. And I know it's, I've been seeing in the chat box, there's been a couple of questions. So we definitely want to allocate some time to go through the questions that, you know, participants have shared for the panel. And maybe just one final question before we open it up. And this is a question for all the panelists is, you know, we are, as we, you know, all know, like in a very challenging time right now. It looks like communities are dealing with a multi-layered crisis, right? In terms of this COVID-19 is really shedding light on the inequities, the structural and systemic inequities in our systems that have persisted, right, for many decades, and how now COVID-19 is really illuminating those challenges that have been there. And, you know, with the challenges and you know, and 2020 being such a critical year, with the census, with an election year, there's so much at stake, right? And it's a time where we know it's not business as usual. Can each of you just talk a little bit about, you know, and we saw what happened in Wisconsin, right? Also, and many other efforts, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty and fear in the community. And, you know, would be great to see if you can just talk about a little bit of, you know, what impact do you feel like, given this new public economic crisis that we're now in, you know, what do you, you know, if we had a crystal ball, what do you foresee happening, you know, at the end of 2020 in terms of, you know, what the pandemic can have in terms of on the election, like any outcomes, overall participation, or just anything that you're observing and that you really think we need to have front and center as we approach these key dates?
I can start if it's okay. So a couple things come to mind. I think one is, I mean, what I hope that happens, right, is that people, you know, become more aware of what are these systemic inequities that exist, right? In particular, right, if you look at the healthcare system, right, you can clearly see that there is a divide, right? There is a divide between those who have access to healthcare and those who do not, right? And then beyond that, there is a divide even for our communities across the immigrant community, right? The fact that they don't have access in such a crucial time to some of these resources that the federal government is making available, right? And many of these immigrant families, right? And I say the entire family, like there's children that are in those families that are born in the US, right? But because of their parent status, they can't access, let's say, for example, the stimulus check, right? They can't access, you know, some of the free healthcare that could be available to them, but it's not being available to them. So what I'm hoping is that it's sort of like an awakening moment of folks understanding that the election this year and the census, right, as the census really drives resources and funding for the next 10 years, is a moment in time that folks understand that being involved and civically involved in these processes is crucial now more than ever, right? So I think from the community perspective, I hope it's sort of like an awakening moment to say, if I'm not involved in the election, if I'm not involved in the census, then ultimately, you know, hopefully this doesn't happen in the future, but we missed an opportunity to do something that's within our grasp to shape the future of our community and our families, right? Now, I think from the government side, right, and I think in particular talking about the election in that's coming up in November, like for California, I feel like we need to, and the government and the local governments need to really implement solutions to address the problems that Paul happened in March, right? The issues around the access to the voting centers, the lack of connectivity, the long lines, all of that stuff, right? But now thinking about the dramatic different sort of public health environment, I think we do need to, especially for LA County, I think vote by mail needs to be available for all registered voters, right? I think that you must take that stance, right? You must take that step because we don't know if the restrictions around social distancing are going to be lifted by then, right? I think Paul mentioned the fact that the workers are the most at risk, right? The people who are at the voting centers, they're the most at risk in the election. So what are we going to do to protect them, right? So along with vote by mail, I think there needs to be side by side vote by mail education, right? There needs to be some sort of education strategy around making sure that the community knows how to do vote by mail, right? That those folks that would normally want to go to the polls or want to go to the voting centers do understand how to do the vote by mail option if that is a choice that they want to make, right? And that they have the information available to them and that they're ready to go. And any new approaches to doing this must be they must be accessible for language minority voters, or they must be in language accessible, right? So they must be accessible for all voters in multiple languages. I think that's something that I hope that the government really takes serious, that each county and the state really takes serious in making sure that language accessibility is going to be key to make sure that our communities can actually come out and vote in November.
Thank you, Ellie. Paul, Stacy, would you like to add to that?
I'll take a step since Stacy's still on mute and I'm not. I just like to expand a little bit on what Ellie said, because that's exactly right. You know, this is an opportunity, this election, with census right on top of the election, everything that's changing, this transition to all vote by mail elections, a lot of focus on the state's part to try to help facilitate expanded turnout, help to make sure, like he was saying, that people have language ballot access around the state, especially since there's going to be this greater emphasis on voting at home. Working with nonprofits and other groups that are reaching out to these communities, texting them, did your ballot come? Do you have everything that you need? You know, do you know how to return it? Like a lot of this stuff, whether email, digital, texting, you know, other kinds of like distance communications with campaigns are going to be really important. And then I'll just tee off on that and say that you're going to have census, then you're going to have election, and then we're going to have redistricting. And redistricting is, in this next elections, next cycle, going to be more important than ever. Not just the state redistricting, which we know that process and we know how to engage in that process, but folks don't realize it. Their local redistricting is being transformed. I spent hours the other day talking about the redistricting that's coming in Long Beach, a commission process just like the state has. Whether you're looking at your local county, your city, your school board, your water district, like the amount of the architecture of our elections is all good in 18 months. And so if you can get involved in the census now, if you can parlay that into pushing your friends and family into voting and being active in this crazy new environment and pushing people out to vote, and then parlay that right into starting to get involved locally and prepared for the redistricting, we could walk out of this whole crisis in 2 years' time with a much better kind of grounding and being much better prepared as part of the kind of civic engagement in our elections. So I think there are some like exciting silver linings potentially.
Thank you. Stacy?
I just have one thing to add. They've really covered it well, but one note I made for myself is I think it's very important, as has been discussed, to talk about educating people on what the new process is, what they need to know, why it's important. But one of the things that I always notice when I look at some of this data is really underscores the importance of community groups for closing some of the gaps and helping overcome some of the barriers, right? Because a lot of the reasons, at least from some of the data that I've seen, that Latinos don't vote, when we know Latinos tend to be younger. And so sometimes lifestyles and socioeconomics of being younger don't always allow for the types of things, certainly, as you mentioned, that we saw even just a little bit ago with like long lines and taking off work. Sometimes those, there are, or if you have childcare issues, right, there are barriers in place. And if vote by mail, certainly there's a big education opportunity around that. But I feel, and if that'll even, who knows, that's for another discussion. But I do think that it's an opportunity for our community organizations to really step in and bring down some of those barriers that are, sort of more socioeconomic that our community has to registering and voting.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've all raised really critical points and information. And, before I am going to turn it over in a bit to Diana with the Hope team that is going to help us go through some of the questions that participants have been sharing. But just really want to highlight, I think, definitely this is a critical year. There's a lot at stake for communities, for our state, for our economic future. And that, really the future of our state is really in the hands of, our community and our ability to be able to participate and have a voice in this democratic process. And so I think key takeaway is that now more than ever, right? It's always been important, but especially in these times, that civic engagement, community education engagement is more critical than ever. And I think organizations and folks that have joined us today are all in a very critical position and place to really help empower and uplift voices of community to ensure that our community gets not only its fair share of resources, but also representation, right? And that we also end up in a stronger place. And I want to encourage everybody that through the Hope Network, and I think there's such great infrastructure to reach out, share information. We know that in this time, everybody's really stretched with resources. This is not a time and no need to reinvent the wheel. I know through Hope, we will be sharing resources and toolkits that NALEO and other organizations have been putting together to help in your efforts. But I'd encourage everybody to reach out to one another and to Hope and see how we could continue to support each other and uplift all the great work that is happening to strengthen our collective efforts. So I would now like to turn it over. I believe it's going to be Diana with Hope that's going to help facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you, Rosie, and thank you to all the fabulous panelists. I just want to remind everyone to please submit your questions in the Q&A feature, and thank you, Stacy, Paul, and Ellie for answering some of the questions that have been coming in the chat box. So our first question, and in a few moments, I'm actually going to be relaunching the poll because a few of you mentioned that you wanted to input your answers, so we'll do that for you. But our first question is, I guess anybody can answer this. What is a good response to the perception that questions on race are negative or racist? So there's I guess a hesitation of answering this question in the census form.
Yeah, if I may. So quickly, I think that, and we always say this in our trainings, we understand that the way to ask both the Latin origin, Hispanic origin question and the race questions are not great ways to figure out the demographic breakdown of the country. We just have to say that up front, right? Because if you start to try to validate the fact that this is, the way to do it, I think you get into a bit of an issue because it's not, right? And we, many organizations made several recommendations ahead of the census to really transform the way that ethnicity is asked in this country, and it was going to be a lot more inclusive to make sure that a lot more communities are included, and that did not happen, right? So I think it's really just important for communities, for organizations to explain the questions in a way that says, look, this is what we have right now in 2020. We have to try to answer as much of this information as possible because for Latinos, right, and specifically Latino, Hispanic, and origin question, if you are Latino, it's very important for you to answer that number 8 question because that is one of the only ways you're really going to be able to figure out how many Latinos in fact are in the country and what and how, from where, right? From what is your ethnic background? What is the ethnic breakdown? And ultimately, right, is the way that the Latinos communities are not erased from the history, right? So I think we have to present that in a strong way. Now, the race question, those same Latinos that we implore to answer the ethnicity question or the Hispanic origin question, they're not really many times going to find themselves on a racial category, right? So I think we have to validate that. There is some other race category, but again, understanding that the Bureau will just point them towards another race if they do decide to place some other race as their racial category. But there's studies that are already predicting that some other race will probably be the largest population group in the country after 2020. I think validate that, explain each of the questions breakdown. As an organization, I don't think we should feed into the fact that it is a racist question. I think we should acknowledge that it is not a great way to capture demographic breakdown of the country, but I do think we need to share that a race question is important for some of the things around making sure that civil rights and civil liberties are protected. And so race demographics and racial numbers and breakdowns, that data is used for those purposes many times, right? So I think explaining that and the importance of these questions is crucial. Acknowledge that these questions are not very sophisticated to be able to really capture the demographic breakdown of this country.
Oh, awesome, thank you. Okay, so the next question, and I think maybe Paul, you can answer, Ellie, or anyone that has the answer. It's around, it's a comparison between the response rate that we have at this point in 2020 to the 2010 census. So do we have those comparable figures of the response rates thus far?
So we have the figures, right? And I'm sorry for taking this question on. We do have the figures and the response rate in sort of real time, right? So the Census Bureau does this in real time. So right now, the national sort of self-response percentage is about 51.6%. And I think for California, we're actually slightly above the national average response at about 52.8%. So I apologize that I haven't made the comparison between 2010 to now, but I do know that, for instance, for us to be above the national average is a positive sign. Now, there are certain operations that have been delayed, such as the update enumerate operation, the update leave operation that goes out to enumerate a lot of your more rural communities, farming communities, agriculture, and more sort of like communities that are sort of really remote. So that percentage of the response for those type of communities is pretty low in comparison to 2010, but it's because a lot of those operations have been delayed. So I know that comparison to 2010, but I don't know the overall comparison. So I don't know if Paul, if you do, but I haven't actually dove into the 2010 versus now because it's such a different time, and COVID-19 has really presented just a totally different environment. So I just haven't made the comparison yet.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say that trying to compare to 2010 is kind of a fool's errand because of so many things are different. I mean, this idea that we're going to be doing them online, the way that it's being rolled out is very different than in prior cycles. We just don't have a good comparison point. Now, the Census Department was supposed to do 4 tests of this new system. They did 1 in Providence, Rhode Island. And I've been in Providence, and I walked around Providence. I spent some time there. It is not like California. Just for the record, Rhode Island, California, very different. And if they'd done the full 4 tests, they might have been able to help us understand what a 51.6% response rate at this point, after having sent out a certain number of mailers and the email or the online tool and all that, they could have told us like what 51.6% means right now. But since they only did 1 test in Providence, we don't know. So we're kind of flying blind on that. And then the second thing, obviously, like, should we be higher than 51.6? Because like everybody's at home. Should we be higher than 51.6? Because like everybody who had broadband access problems, a lot of those broadband access problems have been solved in the last 12 weeks in ways that we hadn't seen solved in the last 20 years. I mean, the amount of, we really don't know what a baseline is supposed to be, and we really don't know if we're high or low based on, no model ever said, like, what if everybody stays at home for 4 weeks? What's going to be the census response rate?
Okay, thank you. The next question is about enumerators. So my question is for folks who do not fill out the forms, will there be enumerators going to people's homes to help them fill out? Folks don't see filling out the census right now as a priority due to the coronavirus. If yes, when is that timeline?
So yes, and thank you, Stacy. I don't know if you want to add the point of although our percentage is statewide 52.8, some of the more dense, hard to count communities are actually far lower in their averages. So thank you, Stacy, for pointing that out. Huntington Park being at 37%, East LA being at 37%. So that is actually really low, right? And these are the communities that historically have had the lowest response rate. So I do think we definitely need to hit more of the hard to count Latino communities and the other communities because they are actually having very low response rates currently. In terms of your question on the operation side, yes, so the non-response follow-up operation has been delayed, right? And this is the operation communities after households have not responded and after the Census Bureau has repeatedly sent them notifications, reminders, and all of that. So currently, it has been delayed until August 11th through October 31st. Now, we are going with the assumption that that is the date when the non-response follow-up operation will begin. But due to the current circumstance and due to not really knowing whether these restrictions are going to be lifted and what the federal government is going to decide to do, not just with the department, with the census, we can only go by what is currently available to us, which is the August 11th through October 31st, being that non-response follow-up period where folks will go out to do the door knocking and try to reach those homes that did not respond to the census.
Okay, so the next question, and I think I'm just going to combine a couple of questions here. It's around a lot of the emphasis right now is in the digital methods to submit your census forms, but because of internet access, as Rosie mentioned with the digital divide, a lot of people are being left out of that message. Or are being left out of receiving that message. So are there any community organizations that are doing other types of outreach to get those hard to reach people?
So I hate to be the only one responding, so feel free to mute me if you need to. But no, so they are, right? And so, Naleo, we partner, and it was interesting because yesterday I had to submit a report, right? We have over like 500 organizations in California, just in terms of the folks that are partnering with Naleo and the groups that we're a part of, engaging in this work. So that's a lot of people in the field, right? I would say for the most part, a lot of them have had to shift to digital, right? Digital outreach, digital organizing, phone banking methods, things of that nature, right? But we have seen some work that is still happening on the ground. So for instance, there are some organizations that are engaging in providing census information in tote bags at the food distribution centers. So they'll work with the center and they'll say, can we give you census one pagers or census tote bag for you to pack the food in there and then distribute it and share that with a family, right? So I've seen that strategy starting to be deployed across the state, which has shown some success, right, with being able to give information directly to folks that are going into the food distribution centers. Another strategy has been those healthcare facilities that are still open and those clinics that are still open. So I definitely want to give a special shout out to Ultimate because they have really been leading on still providing some form of assistance at their health center. That is hard to do, right? Because that means that you are, highest at risk, right? And they are still finding ways to provide either direct assistance or provide a kiosk there so that people that are there waiting can indeed respond to the census while they wait at the waiting centers. And they're rolling census videos, they're looping them at the waiting centers all day, right? So I've seen that still happen on the ground, right? Aside from that, there's a few other things that have been happening, but I think those are the two major things I have seen folks really take on that still requires folks to be on the ground.
Okay, so I'm going to transition to a couple of questions around the election before we let you all go. I want to be considerate of people's time. I think one more question. One is around what is the ideal scenario for the election and this coming November? And do you think that voting by mail, universal vote by mail, is a possibility in the state and in the country?
I mean, it's a guarantee in California that we're going to go to all vote by mail. Like I mentioned earlier, we're already 3/4 of the way there, maybe 4/5 of the way there, with a large number of vote center counties. The biggest difference people are going to see is the emphasis on actually mailing those ballots in and trying to discourage people from trying to go on election day and vote in person. If people do need to go to on election day and vote in person because they need the services that are provided at an election place, like same-day registration, or they need a replacement ballot, or they need assistance, then those services are going to be available. But we want to both deal with the fact that we're going to have very many fewer of those facilities for in-person voting. Only about 1 for every 20,000 residents statewide will probably be the average, and that those facilities are safe for the people who need to go get services or have disabilities or need help, on election day, and that we're not having people go on election day when they can very easily vote in person. Another thing that's likely to happen is there's a current election day +3 rule in California that allows your ballot to count as long as it's postmarked by election day and received within 3 days. They're probably going to expand that to account for ballots that might take longer to get processed in some of these counties. So the state's doing everything it can to facilitate that, and we just kind of have to keep our fingers crossed that they're going to do some semblance of good governance in other states that also are going to need to transition to all vote by mail, or at least prepare to. I mean, if it's all clear in November, will be great, but we need to prepare for being in this kind of situation potentially again.
And then the other kind of related question is around, I guess, voter fraud. So is there a more likely possibility of voter fraud with mail-in ballots? I know that's one of the messages that's being put out there.
No, I think that's a talking point that's been thrown out there a lot, and there needs to be pushback on the fact that there is no systemic voter fraud in California or in the country as a whole. And the vote by mail participation and has been done without California. There's more of a need right now and more of a concern right now about making sure that all the ballots are actually valid and counted, and really not a lot of need to deal with any kind of red herring of a voter fraud issue. The one thing, by the way, about vote by mail is that in California, for a long time, we had a large rejection rate of ballots because the signatures weren't validated, meaning that the signature on the ballot didn't look like the signature that they used to register with. And there were a number of reasons. One, dramatically impacting older voters who maybe used to sign their name with a English alphabet and would revert back to an old signature. Other people, their signatures just change over time. So the state has implemented rules to allow the registrar to look to other signatures, like on your DMV, on your driver's license signature to verify. And also, if they can't match a signature, to communicate with that voter to say, hey, we got your ballot, but there's a problem with your signature, and allow them essentially a month to complete a fix on their, it's called curing the ballot, to get that signature to match. And this is also something that community organizations should be aware of, because those counties now are required to allow the community organizations that are doing the grassroots organizing and the campaigns that are out there on the field to work with the county registrars to try to get those ballots fixed when somebody's signature doesn't get verified. So really in California, we have no excuse for not being able to pull off a good, fair, and safe all vote by mail election.
Okay. Thank you everyone for sending your questions. We still have a few unanswered, and we will try to get to yours through the type feature or at a later time, but that's about all the time that we have left. I'm not sure if Helen is able to join us. So I don't know, Rosie, if you're okay with closing us out.
Sure, thank you. Well, just want to take this moment to thank our panelists again for sharing all this valuable and great information. Just would also like to thank the HOPE staff for organizing this webinar. We hope you have found this information to be of value and inform your work ahead. And so just want to thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the HOPE team, and we can share some of the resources that have been shared via the webinar. So thank you, and hope everybody continues to stay safe and well. Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Ellie.
Likewise, thank you all so much. It was great to be part of that. By the way, Paul, do you happen to know Dorian Cowell by any chance? He's part of our policy research and advocacy team.